The United States was now at war, and overnight, thousands of our sons, brothers, fathers, and husbands were being sent to the front lines in the greatest war of its time, a war that was escalating beyond what anyone could imagine. And one brilliant American mind recognized the imminent danger and warned of its coming.
Albert Einstein wrote that letter to President Roosevelt saying that Germany's buying up all this uranium ore, and he was afraid they were trying to build a bomb.
And if Germany was making a nuclear weapon, both Roosevelt and Einstein knew that the U.S. needed to beat the Germans to it. Roosevelt also knew it was going to be an expensive undertaking. And all that funding had to be kept under the radar so as to not draw attention to the project. FDR knew exactly who could quietly hide the money needed for the Manhattan Project in other federal projects. So the president called up his friend, the senator from Tennessee, Kenneth McKellar.
And he said, "Senator, I need to put a large amount of money against the war effort, and I can't let the press or anyone know how much it is or what it's being used for. Can you help me with that?" Senator McKellar said, "Yes, Mr. President, I can do that for you. Just where in Tennessee are you going to put that thing?"
And in 1942, farmers began to notice unusual happenings in these valleys.
As they built a little spur line off of the main railroad at Elza Gate, and people were wondering about why they, there's no community there. Why are they building this little rail line?
Surveyors came in there, and they were surveying all of this land and getting the names of the owners and all of the buildings and taking pictures of all the buildings.
We noticed that over in the field from us, they were building some sort of a little shed, a reinforced concrete, I guess it was. And they said it was a place to store explosives. And we couldn't understand that.
So we were wondering, people were wondering what's going on.
The Scarborough family talked about their mother told one of the girls to take some water out to the men that were working out there and said, just go out there and take this water out there for them working and just listen and see what you can learn. And of course they didn't know anything either.
The answers came to one community just north of where Oak Ridge is today from a certain senator, as two boys were playing hooky from school.
They were walking down the main street of the little town of Oliver Springs, and they walked by the telephone office. Telephone operator leaned her head out and said, "Lester, go get the principal. He's got an important phone call." The principal came over and took that phone call, went back to the school, called all the students together in an assembly, and said, "I've just gotten a phone call from Senator McKellar. He wants me to tell you to go home and tell your parents you're going to have to find another place to live. The government's going to take your property for the war effort."
Senator McKellar's attempts to forewarn his fellow Tennesseans could only reach so far. And some folks of these communities had to find out in a less neighborly way.
In a matter of days, they were getting the notices tacked up on their doors that said they had 3 weeks to get off their property.
And I remember we came up to our front door with my mother and dad and my brother, and there was a piece of paper attached to the screen door, flapping in the wind. The wire department intends to take possession of your farm on December 1, 1942. That's from November the 11th to December the 1st. It will be necessary for you to move, not later than that date, period. And they were given, to my knowledge, no assistance whatsoever.
We were supposed to be out of this area by December 31st, 1942. And the men who had crops in their fields didn't have time to harvest the crops. Some of them didn't get out in time, and they would bulldoze the fence down, and the cattle would run free.
My mother's mother passed away when they came home from the funeral. there was an eviction notice on the door that they had to be out of their home in 18 days.
I remember us having a meeting in the house, and they told us that the government was taking over again. Mom, Dad did, and they were going to, with someone to look to see if they could find a house out in the county where we could move. Now, you're talking about Mom, Dad, and 6 kids then, 8 people.
A company called the Kingston Demolition Project was making offers on some 60,000 acres on behalf of the War Department.
Well, out of near 50 acres, 40 plus, he only got about 4,000.
My mother had 40 acres of land, and she got $900 for 40 acres of land. But she didn't get that right away. They didn't pay off when you left. It was months before that. So people just had to move in with relatives or anywhere they could find a place to live.
Of course, before the Manhattan Project, there was the Tennessee Valley Authority's project with Norris Dam, and that displaced a lot of people. Many people that moved from the Norris Dam area moved down here.
My mother was Tressie Stooksbury Wright, and her family came from the Loyston area of Norris Dam. They were moved out of there in '33, and I remember my mother telling me that her father grieved for 2 years because his family had been on that land for 200 years.
I was one of 8 children, and we were living in Norris Lake out at Demery community when they started building TVA.
And we lived there, my family did, and all my folks, and I was related to everyone there, and everyone knew everyone else, and it was a traumatic thing when in 1933 and 34 they bought us all the land and for the building of Norris Dam. And my family and many of my kinfolks, I guess there's 10 or 12 or 15 families, moved down the valley to where Oak Ridge is now located.
Some of those people that had to move from Norris down here because of the dam, and then had to move from the Oak Ridge area because of the Manhattan Project, about 20 years earlier had to move out of the Smoky Mountains, especially out of Cage Cove. So don't you know those people that were moving thought that the government just come along every 10 years and told them to go find another place to live?
So they had to replace themselves somewhere else again. And the grandparents were not real happy with the government at that time.
Of course, a lot of people, they didn't like that, and they had to be forced out.
Many of them didn't have automobiles. They didn't have trucks to move their belongings. If they had an automobile, they might not have tires for it, or they might not be able to buy gas for it. Those things were rationed. But what they did have is young men that were in the military that were being killed every week. And they knew that they needed to do anything they could to help win the war. So they got off their property in a matter of weeks.
So when the people of these valleys and ridges were asked to make sacrifices for World War II, they proudly volunteered.
I don't bear a grudge about that because it's been a blessing. It really has.
When I left Oak Ridge, I had anticipated to be back in a day or two. And as it turned out, I never did get back until the whole thing was built in 1949 or so.
As the last truckload of family possessions drove out of the area, the Army rolled in and began building, and 4 mysteriously named facilities, Y-12, S-50, X-10, and K-25,